So, Currency Workshop is kicking off now. Everyone who's still hanging around, thank you. So we're going to really kick it up a gear and go somewhat deeper into what all of this means. So really, what we're looking at is a currency design workshop. What we're looking at is building a liquid protocol for defining currencies. And what I mean by liquid is an extensible language that can describe a whole range of currencies. Now, why currency design? Why am I even up here talking about this? Really, this is, we've had a number of talks around universal basic income. That's where the wider discussion started. And we've covered a lot of this already, but what it comes down to is that the current financial system basically underlies all of the major crises and issues we see in our world today. So whether you're talking about global environmental destruction, whether you're talking about the erosion of social values and norms, whether you're talking about gross inequality, unemployment, homelessness, any of these issues, really, if you boil it right down to it, come right back to the fundamental design of the national monopoly bank currencies, the way they're issued at interest, so the rest of the economy is in debt to the banking system, and that the only way to get more money out than you put in is to take something for nothing from the environment that's currently completely unaccounted for, and the fact that all that sort of stuff is hidden away. Now, we have a new piece of technology that opens up new possibilities in terms of decentralized currencies, that Bitcoin has sort of opened the door to a new set of currencies, but the design of Bitcoin is still very limited in what it's actually enabling and the types of transactions and the types of definitions of value that it allows. In this blockchain space, there's still a real limitation around the thinking around token economics. It generally reduces down to finding ways to get the highest value for your token, which is very different from finding ways to maximize the functioning of an economy. They're two very different discussions. And finally, there's limitations of current token technology. So most of the ICOs we discussed earlier are held in ERC20 tokens. Now, if you create ERC20 tokens, it means you say there will only ever be this many tokens, and that's it. And then we'll start trading them off against each other. Now, that might be all right if you're trying to, maximize value and allow for some pump and dump scenarios, as they're called. But if you're issuing driver's licenses, then would you be wanting to be limited to a particular number of them? Or if you're certifying that people have a certain amount of knowledge and you're trading educational tokens against, for each other, that really shows you how limited of a value accounting system a fixed number of tokens allows. And it's led to a lot of very strange things. And there's other limitations in there as well. Now, the last month, we actually had a very broad conversation around using incentives and noticing the various worldviews as defined in spiral dynamics. So I'm not going to cover all this ground again. This is basically just to remind people that we're here, that we discussed a whole different range of worldviews that we see in organizations and in different currency design systems in terms of the underlying assumptions of whether, everyone's out for themselves, or whether it's about your tribe or your group or humanity as a whole or the entire planet or the universe, and the different ways in which these different value systems and worldviews play off against each other in the real world. and how if we're looking at a UBI, a universal basic income, it plays at one particular level, but it doesn't necessarily align with some of the other worldviews, and therefore the adoption may be better served by a more nuanced currency model and a combination with other different currency models, such as mutual credit, for instance, which is another type of currency system where, like a barter card, where groups of people agree to issue each other a certain amount of credit, and that can be run with a number of different ways. So the different types of incentives for different groups is where we left off last time. So today, I'd like to take us back to a very early point and start talking about currency by way of different metaphors. So there's some common metaphors that different people use. There's the metaphor of currency is like water, right? So if you have an environment and, everyone in that environment needs water, right? And water cycles through environments, and that creates a healthy flow, and you can easily start to picture, if you extend that metaphor, what happens when water pools in certain places, what happens when there's areas where there's no water available. And you could look at UBI in the frame of rain that rains down everywhere on a regular basis. For people here who specifically want to discuss universal basic income and lobbying the government for that, Josh here actually has a separate meetup that he runs once a month.
It's next Tuesday.
Which is next Tuesday, where they talk about what it would take to actually get basic income implemented in Australia. This is a sort of a broader conversation than that one. Another metaphor that I like as well is that currency really is a language or a protocol for describing value. So, to be able to exchange value with each other, we all need to speak the same language, right? If you're speaking French and I'm speaking English and we don't understand each other, then that's as useful as me handing you Australian dollars and you only being able to spend francs or euros today. You need to have that same language in order to define what value is. And currencies really tend to be a way of substituting for trust, right? So if I give my car to my friend, that's okay. I trust that he'll give it back to me in one piece. If I give it to a stranger who I don't trust, then he's going to be, paying me a bunch of money for it so that at least I get, something back out of it because I can take that money anywhere. So it substitutes for trust. In the same way, there are a number of other ways that we substitute for trust that we don't tend to look at as currencies. And I mentioned some of them before. If we look at university degrees, then the reputation of the university is parceled off and passed on to that person. So me having a university degree gives me some of the credibility of the university where it came from, and it's been passed on to me. And there is actually a flow back the other way in which my performance lifts or lowers the actual reputation of that university. And finally, currencies can be looked at as the DNA of social organisms. So this basically says that if you have a currency, it really defines the way a larger group or organization functions. So if you look at today's currencies as DNA, you can look at the way that they impact the way corporations function. And if you look at a corporation as an actor that's based on the DNA structure of money and the fact that they are built to accumulate more and more and externalize costs, so they're spewing out rubbish everywhere they go, and they're just doing that to accumulate larger pools of money with no responsibility or accountability to their impacts, then you could look at the DNA that our current monetary system represents as some form of cancer in terms of the way, what else can you think of that just grows and grows and grows and spits out toxins? So that's, one metaphor that you can take and you can play with as you start to imagine what currencies are needed. So, if there was one slide and one thing that I would want to say to the rest of the blockchain world, this is it, right? So there are three basic functions of money. And we're talking about a store of value, which really is the function of an asset. So if you have forest, then that is a store of value. If you have a house, that's a store of value. And the cryptocurrencies that are out there today, they are optimizing to be a store of value. They're optimizing to get more money and get more money and get more money. The thing about a store of value is its worth is by sitting there and accumulating in big pools in some cases, but it's valuable because it doesn't move and sits there. Then you have another function here, which is a medium of exchange. So really a currency is about currents. It's about being a medium of exchange, being able to be exchanged between people for goods or services. And ultimately, this is a piece that every human being should have sufficient access to, because otherwise you end up with an economy or a society where people have excess capacities and abilities to produce goods or services that would raise the quality of life of people, but be prevented from offering those simply because the medium of exchange isn't there, which doesn't make sense. It would be kind of like having homelessness and unemployment at the same time, which just would never happen, would it? Because you would just get the people who are unemployed to build more houses and problem solved in any rational world. Same with hungry people and unemployed people. You would just get them to make some food and feed the hungry people. Of course, our current financial system doesn't allow for that, because hungry people tend to be hungry because they don't have the money, they don't have the medium of exchange to be able to reward the person who feeds them. And finally, there's unit of account. And that's just the piece about accounting. That is accounting for, that's a measuring what has transpired. And the current monopoly currencies, right, the bank money that's backed by the threat of force from the government and the need to pay taxation, that is trying to fill all these three functions. But it is, again, it's optimized to be an asset. And what happens when you use an asset as your unit of account? It means that you're using a currency which fluctuates in price, which is a problem that we've seen with Bitcoin as well. If you're trying to use Bitcoin to pay your, for your daily necessities, then your coffee today is a different price than your coffee yesterday, right? And really, to me, the idea of having your store of value, your assets, being used as your unit of account when they have floating exchange rates is the same as if you were to trade meters against feet. Imagine if you buy a meter of wood and then sell 3 feet of it. And because you did that, the feet became shorter and the meter became longer, because that's how floating currency exchanges work. It wouldn't be very useful for the builders in the room in order to be able to have a consistent unit of measurement. So that's that fundamental issue. You have the fact that the medium of exchange shouldn't ever be the reason something doesn't happen. There can be a lot of reasons not to do something, but a lack of being able to exchange things with each other should not be that issue. If I have value I can offer, I should be allowed to offer it without being penalized in the current system for that. Now, when we look at that, so this is the biggest reason why we need a more nuanced language for defining currencies. It's the fact that we need languages that can define all of these. And there are different types of currencies that we've already seen work today, and we've seen work both at a large, national and corporate scale, as well as in community settings to measure different things. So we've got the national monopolies, also called proof of force. We have commodity or asset-backed currencies. So a lot of people have spoken about, gold-based currencies or proof, evidence of access to gold held in vaults elsewhere. We have some corporate currencies around Mikeys and gift cards and vouchers. Now, historically, markets have been based entirely on the issuance of currencies by one or two trusted large providers of goods. And that's actually worked quite well for the merchants, which was why those currencies were promptly outlawed in favor of national currencies at the time. National currencies have actually only been around for quite a short time, 200 years, give or take. Now, mutual credit is another type of currency that I've mentioned before. So has anyone here heard of LETS? Local exchange trading groups? Yep. So there are mutual credit groups operating in Australia and around Melbourne, where basically the members of the group extend credit to each other. Now, one of the nice aspects of mutual credit is when a new person joins the group, the total amount of credit in that group automatically expands because they have effectively an overdraft limit that comes without any interest attached. So they can just start trading and buying or selling back and forth with each other. And when they leave the group, or if they leave the group, then the total amount of credit available contracts. So it's a self-regulating money supply that fluctuates with the number of people there. So that's something that ERC20 tokens cannot do. You have reputation systems. So these are not generally monetized, but there's definite value in being number one on TripAdvisor. There's definite value in a lot of these things in terms of advertising, right? A lot of people on YouTube are getting paid a lot of money just based on how many likes and how many viewers their particular account attracts. So there's value there, but that's generally not considered as currencies yet. Licenses and registrations. So these are, something you can evidence, and the evidence of that substitutes trust. Can I trust you to drive a car? Show me your license, and that's enough. I won't trust your word because you're a stranger, but I will trust this centrally issued, verified public document that could be hashed on a blockchain at some point in time. And titles and degrees, I've mentioned them as a substitute of trust earlier. So these are some of the different types of currencies that you would want a single language to be able to encode for. And the idea is that we need to start building this language with some of the experts we have in the room today and not here yet. So another message that I had for people during the break as well was most of the cryptocurrencies being built today tend to be trying to compete with the national currencies directly. They're like, well, Bitcoin isn't going to overtake it because Bitcoin Cash will and will be the money for everything. When in countries like Australia, where most people have bank accounts, access to credit cards, access to debit cards, mortgages, share portfolio accounts and all those sorts of luxury things, trying to compete with the national currency is very, very difficult, especially at this early stage of the technology when, let's face it, it's really hard to use. More niche currencies that are fit for purpose allow currencies to actually specifically fix an issue that they're trying to address. So if you look at Mikey today, right? Mikey is not Australian dollars. It's numbers on a plastic card that we happen to know we can use in public transport around Melbourne. And it is much easier than using cash, because no one has to sit there and count your money and give you back the correct change and all of that complicated stuff around cash. So it is better and more powerful than Australian dollars for that one specific thing. And some of the trust marks and reputation brand certifications, I'm talking about animal-friendly marks, or this is certified organic produce. All of these things are actually a way of trying to elucidate and make visible certain intrinsic value within products as well. So that's also a very specific niche that currencies like trust marks are better for than just using Australian dollars and pricing everything with a single price. Then there's actually figuring out what in your community are the specific needs and what specific resources you have, and finding a way for a currency to build a bridge between them. And one of the examples I like to give here is Curitiba in Brazil. So there were slums in Brazil, and they had very specific issues. They had very narrow streets that the rubbish trucks couldn't get down. And they had lots of unemployed people. That's why they were living in slums. And they had lots of public transport that no one could afford to take. So the mayor of Curitiba actually turned around and said, you know what? We're going to hand out tokens to anyone who's going to bring us the rubbish from the favelas. We're going to bring the rubbish to collection points. You'll be handed tokens which you can use on the bus. And what happened was that thousands of tons of rubbish was collected by school kids. Oh, that's right. The last piece of that was schools were also incentivized to be able to trade these in, and in exchange for uniforms and books. So thousands and thousands of tons of rubbish were collected by school kids. They got tokens, they got school books, they got clothes, and their parents were able to afford to use the excess tokens to travel into the city to get jobs, and it actually had a major boost to their local economy by combining two seemingly completely disparate things. We have rubbish on one hand and buses on the other, right? And just having a one token fits all, this is going to be money, doesn't make that happen. It's only when someone actually sees the need in a particular community and sees the resources in a particular community and is able to connect those two together. And this is the reason why we're looking to build a language and a platform that makes it easy enough for anyone to build these currency platforms with all the education built into it, to be able to see those opportunities and make specific currencies for a community that we can't even imagine from this end of the process. There's also the idea of provenance. So one of the things about blockchains having this history of everything that's ever happened, sometimes that's very useful in terms of seeing where products and goods have gone through the supply chain and having that available to all the parties all the time. So that can help against counterfeiting of products. It can help, I would love to be able to scan in vegetables at the local market and see that it was picked yesterday instead of picked 6 months ago in some random country that doesn't have any standards around what pesticides are used, for example, right? Or to see that, this piece of clothing didn't come from a sweatshop because here's a photo of the person who made it. Random example. And finally, compound currencies. So this is the idea that sometimes there are currencies that interact with each other in different ways, so that one currency may not be sufficient. So today, the easiest example is you have your bank balance and you have your credit score that's made up of your credit repayment history and also the amount of assets you have on hand. And by combining those different tallies, the bank decides how much money you can borrow. But what if you kept the bank balance but changed your access to credit to be related to, I don't know, a social and environmental impact analysis? So the organizations that had a positive social and environmental impact had more access to credit than those that had negative impacts. Or what if it's based on your reputation score? This can be a good thing, this can also be a very bad thing, depending on how it's implemented. And also identity, reputation, and impact. So I've covered impact a little bit, but there is a trade-off in having identity and reputation. So Bitcoin and some of the other cryptocurrencies like Monero and Zcash have really focused on this anonymity, right? The idea of not being able to be shut down by the government because they can't see who I am. And they can't decide what I can and cannot spend money on. So I should be anonymous, I should hide behind my computer screen and a particular address. That can be really useful in some countries where, for instance, I could get shot for spending money and being a woman, or being the wrong religion, or any different reason that tomorrow's government might decide that I should be cut off from the banking system altogether. So there's a definite case to be made for the right to be forgotten and the right to privacy. At the other end of that, when we talk about currencies being a substitute for trust, ultimately what we're talking about is what has traditionally been a factor of identity and your reputation. And if I know that the person that I'm interacting with has interacted well with people before them, I am more likely to trust them. So reputation in itself is also a substitute for trust. And this becomes really important when we start speaking about the need for ongoing governance of these currency systems. So once you have a shared community that has a currency that they've decided to use, that in itself becomes a common resource to that community. The community shares in the common wealth and knowledge and experience and a shared agreement of what is money, and therefore has a shared responsibility as to the governance of that. And what we've seen in platforms like Bitcoin and Ethereum is that when the community is random people who don't know each other, who are all just trying to maximize the amount of money that can get out of this thing, isn't actually a community. Nobody knows each other, nobody trusts each other, nobody on a daily basis is actually building relationships with each other except for very, few distinct little clusters and subgroups. So you don't actually have a community that's able to govern itself because you have this anonymity and lack of reputation in that system. So when you start talking about cooperative and collaborative governance, which is one of the amazing opportunities in blockchain technology, the idea that rather than having an Uber platform that owns 20% of all the taxi fares just for creating a little piece of software and replacing that with Arcade City or any one of a number of others, which are shared platforms owned by the taxi drivers themselves, or the same thing with Airbnb compared to Fairbnb, where people who own the rooms actually share that platform. You need to manage these, right? Everyone involved in that should have the same amount of influence on what happens to that system, right? If it's not meeting the needs of that community, it should be able to be updated and changed as they progress in their worldviews, as the situation around them changes and the way that their needs change and their worldviews change. Their currency system should be able to adapt to their current environment, and the only way that's going to happen is some form of shared governance. So, what we come to out of this is we have a number of requirements that a liquid protocol for defining currencies would need to have. It has to be scalable. It has to be able to scale to the point where it helps all the humans. It has to be able to serve the needs of the 2.1 billion households that are currently unbanked, as well as the needs of billions of people who may have bank accounts but don't have the facilities to be able to clean the ocean, save the rainforests, feed the hungry, house the homeless, do all the things that the monopoly currency systems are designed to avoid. And it needs to be extensible. So as I said, there will be needs for a lot of currencies that we can't even think of yet, that will address needs for specific communities that cannot be foreseen from the outside, from a distance. And it needs to have a fixed namespace. So if somebody creates a happy coin, then that should be the happy coin, not to be confused with others, and that way they can all operate in the same global space without bumping into each other and causing confusion. And I'll come with that in a second. So there should be real-world integration, because at the moment, the fiat monopoly currencies are devoid of a connection to our natural world. It's like we've forgotten that our entire economy actually fits within an ecology. And that's a real issue. So we have this inbuilt need for endless growth on a finite planet. An 8-year-old can tell you that that can't work, yet politicians are incentivized to come up with the same solution of jobs and growth every single time, when that jobs and growth is completely devoid to the impact of growth and jobs on the natural environment that ultimately underpin everyone's ability to survive. So, we all know the world is changing. I think we can all feel it, that change is coming, and there's some real issues that are coming. So something is going to have to change, and this is a fundamental piece for us being able to account for the damage and or restoration of our ecosystems that we all depend on. And also there is assets and oracles. So to be able to tie currencies back to the real world, to be able to have land and food tied into our currency systems and allow, for instance, your primary producers, the people that grow food, to be able to issue the currencies in advance so they don't have to rely on a financial system looking to extract value, resulting in the whole of South Werribee farming community not being able to survive and disappearing in, say, the next 5 years. So having that tie-in to the real world for a lot of these currencies is very important. And the ability, for instance, to put your house on a blockchain and issue currencies against it is also something that gives a lot of freedom to people that don't have access to banking facilities at all. As a few basic examples of what I mean by assets and oracles are simply a fancy way that the blockchain world talks about finding out information in the real world and having blockchain technologies and cryptocurrencies respond to it. Identity and privacy. So I discussed this before. So having the ability to track and trace reputation and relationships as well as responsibilities versus fungibility. So there's a bit of a threat at the moment. So one of the fundamental things about the national monopoly currencies is that they are legally required to be fungible. And that means that any dollar is as good as any other dollar. And this is enshrined. So what that means is if you rob a bank and no one has proven that you've robbed the bank, but you then go into a store and buy something with the money, the store has to accept the money, and you cannot be, the money itself cannot be proof of anything, and it can't be traceable because that every dollar has to be the same as every other dollar. Because if every store had to verify every note that came in the door, the whole money system would grind to a halt. However, in a lot of the blockchain space, because all these transactions are traced right back to the start, there are various governments that are trying to figure out and find ways of tying Bitcoin, for instance, to earlier transactions, and then trying to find ways of maybe prosecuting people for owning Bitcoins that were used to buy drugs that might be illegal in a particular country. And so far, it hasn't happened, but as that threat is actually quite fundamental to the viability of these cryptocurrencies as money altogether, because fungibility is very important to a medium of exchange. Not so much to a unit of account that shouldn't really need to move, or to assets, because they tend to be unique anyway by their nature. And we have a visual design language that is simple for people to understand. So as we design this, we also need to build interfaces that people can interact with in countries where they may have low literacy rates. So I've simplified that and just said pictures with friends. I want to be able to send a smiley face to someone and that be their reputation currency. But of course, if I call it smiley, it needs to be a unique type of smiley. And the next part there is auto-registration with wallets. So, yep.
Question on fungibility.
Yeah.
Whilst I understand the need for the currency to be liquid, wouldn't there be some benefits to potentially looking at handshakes for transfer of currency? So what you don't have with physical currency is any way to kind of do a handshake transaction where I say, yes, I have given money to Phil, and I gave it to him, but he accepted it, so therefore it's a transfer there. Isn't that a benefit to cryptocurrencies that you can't get from physical non-existent?
Sorry, I'm trying to understand the question as to how it relates to fungibility. The fact that you have specific transactions between specific people is very useful. I'm talking about is every unit of currency the same as every other unit of currency? So you could keep account of, for yourself, of every dollar and who you got it from. The risk is more if, for instance, Phil tomorrow turns out to be a Muslim and that becomes illegal, as a random case, not to single out anyone for any religious reason, it's an example only. So if it turns out that, by being the wrong religion, he is illegal, and therefore any money that he spent becomes, blacklisted in your wallet, that's a problem, because then you can't trust that handshake even though you know who it came from. So that's sort of the difference in fungibility. But having the identity and the reputation for your own sake allows you to have that trust in the person you're interacting with. Now the next sort of piece I have here, so is the auto-registration. So I'm not sure how many of you have tried to buy into an ICO and found that you had a real challenge because it was new and you didn't know if the hardware wallet that you had could accept it, and mostly they don't, and they have an accepted list, and you just have to wait a few weeks and then they'll add support for that. Even though most of them are ERC20 tokens, they're still not on the list. So can you give them a call and will actually anyone get back to you as to when they're doing that? And you just kind of have to wait. Does this sound familiar to anyone? Yep. All right. So, at the moment, you're waiting on exchanges and you're waiting on different wallet providers to add support for each new currency. Well, what if your wallet was compliant with a particular protocol, a particular language, and if you sent money to someone, it simply came in with a message saying, here's a happy transaction, right? Staying with the happy coin, and your phone goes, oh, I don't know happy. And the other person's phone goes, oh, that's all right. This is happy, and sends all the necessary instructions for this is how that currency is built, and effectively auto-registers right in your wallet, and then immediately has a repeat of that transaction, puts the balance into the wallet, and you're done. So it automatically updates into the wallet and allows you to accept the currency that's offered. And that way, if you have an exchange, whether it's today's centralized exchange or a decentralized exchange, which I won't get into now, as soon as the exchange sends you your money, it can automatically send you everything you need to know. Mystical Future Super Wallet. That's just a working title. So a big part of building this language, and we're I would say early design stages at this moment. So a big part of building this wallet, this language, is building the interfaces that deal with it, building the wallet that can work on your mobile, that can work in your browser, that can work as a standalone application, and that sort of thing. Now, there is one project that has done a fair amount of work in this space, and it's actually Scepter, short for Receptor. It's tied to Holochain, and we actually have a gentleman down the back here who's the chief engineer on that project. So they've actually done a fair bit of work as well. So I think I'm going to pick Phil's brain later on tonight, and we'll see where we get to. But that's all beside, by the by. So those are some sort of important things. And also, what I haven't mentioned there is the ability to run on simple mobile devices, the Nokias that they have throughout most of the third world, rather than relying on the latest and greatest tech that we have today. So those are some of the things we need, and that's really all I wanted to blast into people's brains as a point of understanding. For now, that is the basic goal of creating a liquid protocol for defining currencies. Now, my question to all of you is, what are you missing? What would you like to see in this space as we continue to discuss currency design, and as we continue to explore this further, as there will be a different seminar every month, and we'll change the topics, we'll go broad, we'll go specific. What is it people would like to get to understand better? What are your questions? Yep.
One of mine is trying to understand what concepts are logical to be applied to a blockchain scenario and then simply a great idea that doesn't necessarily require blockchain.
Okay, that's a pretty big topic. Voting.
Yeah. There are great ideas out there, but
Yeah.
some of them I look at and I think, great idea, but I don't quite understand the blockchain connection.
Yeah.
Why is that idea, why wouldn't it work just as effectively under a non-blockchain?
Yeah.
Can I answer that a little bit?
Yeah, go ahead. So,
I had the same issue. I couldn't understand why all these ICOs were using blockchain. And a lot of it is noise.
Mhm.
And it looks like magical fairy dust. One example that I found that
made me understand how a blockchain can work is in the logistics game. I wasn't aware. I'm sure everyone knows what a container ship looks like. Everyone's seen the ISO containers. What I wasn't aware is that when the ships come, and ships are obviously a lot slower than aircraft and any other form of transport, by the time the ship lands from overseas, it's already been pre-cleared at customs. And generally, that means the admin staff already know the container's coming, and they sort of already know what's in there, and they're ready to release it. But what comes in parallel to the container is what's called the bill of landing. And that comes in an envelope. It actually comes via airmail. So obviously that's going to feed the container to safe to explore. When this came up to me, I didn't understand it. I said, why would you use the bill of landing and the paper envelope when you can just use a PDF or an email to tell the admin girls that there's a container coming? And what they said is a PDF and a JPEG and an email can be manipulated and a lot of fraud can occur. So what actually happens is when a container comes in, they actually get a yellow slip and a red slip and a blue slip, and you can't copy that. Equivalent would be a house land title. When the banks settle or if you refinance or whatever, you can't just go to the bank and say, here's a copy of my title. They have to pull it from the title office, and it has a hologram on it. There's only one title. So with the blockchain, and I don't know if this is explaining it to you, with the blockchain, up until now, it's the only electronic way in those applications that you could electronically send such a digital document, and it is protected and it counters any chance of fraud that a JPEG, email, and PDF cannot do. Electronic signing can only go so far, but the blockchain used for land titles or moving containers is super quick, and you basically cannot commit any acts of fraud on it. Hopefully that gives you a little bit of an insight.
That's
security application for the documents.
That's some of them. Look, it's in terms of the ICOs, there are probably a good percentage of them that simply don't need it. I do think Provenance, anything in the supply chain area can really benefit from having that unforgeable history. Anything.
Supply chain, that's my industry. Because I've seen RFID tags, which is the active tags. You can scan them and see the temperature control and everything else. The point is, the example you gave is I think a great one for secure information.
Yeah.
But if you actually want to have a network that you have to have something that actually verifies that what's in there is actually in there, and and all the blockchain does is actually secure that information into its transmission.
Yeah.
Blockchain would be behind the RFID.
Yeah, well, RFID isn't viable for a number of reasons anyway. But I guess what I'm curious about is, to me, I'm sorry, you were still answering this question.
That's quite all right. Just go for it, and I'll see if I can get back to
What I'm
it.
curious about is I really enjoyed the way you broke down the different aspects of currency. And I love the fact that you talk about it as a way of communicating value. And what's implicit to me in this slide is a whole bunch of values.
Yeah. Oh, yeah.
And if I go back to the previous one where you talked about, was it Caravita or?
Curitiba? Yeah.
Yeah, thank you. So yeah, you had someone there that had a view of how to create value, and also was in a position of power to create that influence.
Yeah.
And so on. So what I'm hearing, there were a lot of really good examples that were basically leveraged off existing power structures and power dynamics, where someone had applied a value system that symbolized still something that was linked to the current currency environment. And there are a number of examples, and then we're talking about basically redefining the whole value system, which is saying that environmental impact should be part of the currency system. I totally agree with it. So I love this. I'm just really struggling with
How they come together.
Yes.
Yeah. And look, ultimately, if you start, you bring in a standard for triple bottom line accounting, right? Accounting for the environmental impact of everything, or you say carbon now has a price, and it's decentralized and bottom up like this, then if you've got 99% of the world on it, but the top 100 companies that are responsible for 70% of global carbon emissions just decide not to sign up, then you've basically done nothing, right? So how to implement these specific things in a lot of ways is incredibly important. And basically the idea for the protocol is, yes, to launch it in a million ways, including working with governments top down through things like the threat of GDPR. There's regulation coming out of Europe that basically says if you get hacked and you don't disclose everyone whose information you've leaked, then you lose a ridiculous amount of money, so you shouldn't be holding that information, right? Things like that, as well as education outreach into schools where you go, hey kids, your current money system works like this. I wonder what it would be like if you got a bit of pocket money every week. Would you like to set it up on this? And then your class or your school can create its own basic income, and you can trial that and play with that. And by the time you get to the workforce in 10 years' time, you're incredibly familiar with the different ways these things work. And therefore, you can have that broader vision. So some of it's very much a long tail thing, and some of there are people that are crying out for solutions right now that you hand them this tool and you give them a PDF and say, just go for it. They'll be building their own in no time at all. And I don't think one thing is going to nail it, but I think giving the ability to everyone in a user-friendly, simple and easy way will allow these things and will allow communities, especially primary producers, to be able to solve their own issues and create food security and create energy security and also create models. Yep.
Again, I love it.
Yep.
I love
Yep.
that.
But how?
Well, and there's the flip side to it, which is if it becomes a technology that everybody has access to. So I used the issue you talked about for kind of where we're at in 1996, and then you've got young men in their 20s and 30s who are watching huge online porn empires, which is having a huge impact on young women and men as well, creating the patterns for addiction and anxiety early on. In some ways, it's almost, in my judgment, it's a judgment.
Yeah.
More power than someone who doesn't have the sense of community responsibility should have. So could I also not create a currency that only the cool kids get to use?
Look, I think somebody will create a porn currency, if they haven't already. And I might not personally like it. I might also not be able to do anything about it, because fundamentally the technology is out there for people to create their own currencies. And all I'm hoping to do is to try and inject some sense and some of these values into that ecosystem, built into the tools that I help to put out there for people to create their currencies. The fact that there will be good uses and bad uses, I think there's a lot of people that sort of say, Bitcoin only for drugs and pornographers and that sort of thing. Well, that was the internet way back when. But now the fact is the bulk of people use the internet for what the bulk of people want to do, which is, entertainment and shopping. And yes, there's still a lot of porn on there, but it will match the values of the society as a whole. And I'm hoping that by giving people the ability to manage their own communities, at least at a local level, it empowers people and starts to reverse a little bit the cycle of infantilization that is very evident in Australia and a lot of other countries as well.
An example of doing that in a local community, like what would that actually look like? Even if it's just a use case, a vision, like what would that actually like? How would you go about setting it up? Because to me, it's much more than technology.
It is. Look, these are social challenges. Look, there are a number of platform cooperatives. There are, 8 out of 10 Australians are actually involved in cooperatives in some form or other, and all these cooperatives are actually governing themselves in different ways. So how to govern yourself is out there already. The thing is that at the moment, the all these cooperatives. They're existing in what's potentially a hostile environment for cooperatives in terms of it's very difficult to access any lending by banks because really you want a single private owner, much easier on the paperwork. There's very little legal advice out there for it. If you're looking for legal advice around cooperatives, start by talking to the Business Council for cooperatives and mutuals, for instance, because they've faced all these problems and started trying to create and isolate some of these resources, but it's difficult. And having this sort of as a technology piece doesn't take away from the challenge of actually getting people to work together and trust each other and all of that sort of thing. So this isn't going to create a utopia by itself, but it is a platform and a piece of technology that has to be coupled with an education piece and a platform.
There are demands to use it for what you judge as beneficial purposes.
Yeah.
Also acknowledging that it could be used for non-beneficial purposes.
Yeah.
It's out there.
Exactly.
So there is some demand, so like trying to create an opportunity for where there is demand to sort of fund it, kind of create a gender in a place that's where the current system doesn't support it.
Exactly. So,
Not people willing to invest in it. So,
and the people that are involved in building this right now will make sure that we're pushing it out to projects we believe in, but ultimately it's available to everyone because we're not going to charge, mothers in Africa, $100,000 license fee. It's here you go, and let's find, someone who can help you use this. This gentleman over here, Mr. LA Lakers.
We're I'm part of a group that's doing exactly that, basically disaster mitigation or mitigation projects. But my platform is more of a visualization tool, and I'm here to learn how blockchain can actually create transparency between donations and delivering them to the suppliers that are actually creating these projects. So the way that, I'll just really quickly explain, it's like SimCity. So we drag and drop objects into a 3D environment. That's a shared space. All stakeholders from around the world can actually see what's being created. But it's also on a data management platform. So the project is called Rock Against Poverty. It's 50 events in 25 countries, so it's $1 billion annually for poverty alleviation and disaster mitigation project. And we're after a blockchain solution. So that's why we're for a whole chance. The whole chance. No, so I mean it's an event platform, but we just hired the Imagine Festival. All of the same principles can be applied to humanitarian crises like the living refugee camp. So we're essentially just bringing those two industries together and making it possible for an event organiser to use that platform to nominate percentage of their tickets to go to fund these pre-simulated projects, where all the costs are known, all the suppliers are known.
I know someone I need to put you in touch with, and I'll catch up and have a chat with you. Over by the bar. So yeah, that's awesome. That's great. Any other sort of questions? What would you like to hear next month? Yep. Oh, of course. Mm-hmm.
But I think the problem is always between the technology and the real life.
Yeah.
So, for example, with great technology such as everyone invests, it's actually creating a very safe, very high security system.
Mm-hmm.
Because every time we react to kind of activity,
Yeah.
I'm thinking counting that every phone,
Mhm.
their own systems of cannot with money exchange. Every phone is to be produced currencies, white coins.
Mhm.
Debit stuff in the phone is kind of like a new type of government.
Yeah.
Then what's the incentive for them to help with currency technology?
So the way I sort of look at it is Bitcoin is like, the question, if anyone didn't hear it, by the way, is does everyone really need all this? Or is this just vastly over-engineered? Is that a decent summary?
Maybe only 1% of them.
Yeah, maybe only 1% of people need this degree of over-engineering. And the way I like to sort of look at that is Bitcoin is like one of those giant, huge brick mobile phones. The very first iteration of this is mobile, but you'd better have a backpack to be able to power it and drag it around with you and maybe have 2 other people help you carry it because it's that big, and the total global market is about 100 of these phones before the next one comes out. And now we're starting to see the next iteration, and the idea is that we're going to fully functional smartphones that are the most highly over-engineered devices for texting and calling each other that you can imagine, right? So one of these things has, I don't know, 50,000 times the processing power that it took to get to the moon, something like that. I'm pulling that number out of thin air, but it's probably not that far off. And it's incredibly over-engineered for what the 1% use it for. So the idea is that when you build this, you architect it correctly at the bottom so that it is secure, but you also make the interface user-friendly enough that it's easier to use than everything else. And already, even though Bitcoin is not user-friendly at all, and it's difficult and hard to use, it's allowed people for the first time to issue currencies that cannot be counterfeited. And that actually means that something that was completely impossible is now possible, and therefore much easier than it was, even though to actually use those is very difficult. Basically, as time goes on, this sinks into the background. You don't know what's happening. You just go, oh, I just received a smile. And everything else is taken care of for you. And yes, there are places where people can agree that seashells might be an appropriate currency. They've been used before, but only in mountain settings, for instance, where there are not a lot of seashells to be found, right? Things like that. So, yeah, does that sort of, that's my take on it. So not everybody needs it, and the idea is that the people that do will be the first adopters.
Can I just add something?
Sure.
Back to someone was bringing up the third world country. Does anyone know how they move money in Papua New Guinea in the villages? What's that? Yeah, credit. So
M-Pesa.
Papua New Guinea is our nearest neighbour. I think the most southern part of Papua New Guinea and our most northern part, which is Torres Strait Islands, is about 4 kilometres. So if you ever go there, it's a different planet. You can't get around PNG, there's no roads, you've got to fly with a helicopter to all the major cities. There's places so remote they've never even seen white people. But you go there and everyone's name is Noah, Mary, Abraham, Joseph. That's because the Christian missionaries hundreds of years ago went there. So they're very, very isolated. I think it came up before about the type of phone. Most people there don't have a touch screen. It's the old, what we throw away, the push button LCDs. So you couldn't get onto some of these wallets. It just wouldn't work because there's no GUI. So what they work out is the village has a hut, little solar panel, and a phone for the village, and they move phone credit between each other. And that's their barter system because there's no ATMs, there's no electricity out there, and it seems to work very, very, very good. Obviously, you couldn't move $1 million, but out there, $50, $100, $300, and they're obviously using the GSM network. not Wi-Fi data. But I just thought I'd throw that in there, that our near neighbours, third world country, are moving money in a non-traditional sense that sort of parallels ours somewhat.
Yeah. Kenya, M-Pesa's in Kenya. I'm not sure what the provider is over there. Yep. Yeah.
So there was some really important input into kind of currency design.
Mhm.
Have you got like thinking about maybe putting out that out there for public input?
Yeah. I need to put this up on the website. If anyone wants to be emailed the slides, then just pass me some details. I'll more than happy to send them out to everyone. So yeah, I'll put them up, and I'll put the last month's up there as well. Except I haven't actually written down everything I've said. So it's a bunch of slides that I think you need to have been in the room to get the full context of it. But I'll put some words down, and I'll put it on my website at thenewmoneyinstitute.com, and we'll go from there. Yep.
I think just cycling back to what that gentleman was saying over there before about using it for logistics. So the usability of blockchain on that isn't just like verify, like where you get rid of the bill of landing. A lot of it has to do with the letters of credit that the banks control at the moment. So because I don't know you and you don't know me, and I'm going to send you a shipment, if your shipment lands to me, if the money, if like you said, what's inside the shipment isn't actually there, it's very, very difficult for me to go to find you and ask you for the money back, because like we have different jurisdictions, we have different laws. So even if I could find you, there's nothing that says I can claim it. So what actually controls that is the letter of credit. So that my bank says, look, if you open the box that I sent you and there's nothing inside, there's a limit there that will actually pay you back. The bank will pay you back, and then the bank will chase me for the money.
Yeah.
So by having blockchain, the idea is that you can get rid of that letter of credit, because the money won't be transferred to you until that's actually been ticked off. So it eliminates that third party and allows us to trade without having to need that third party intermediary in there. So there's practical uses for it. I guess it's just whether you can build a system that allows that to happen organically and easily, and that normal people do trades on it without.
Yeah,
thinking.
and there are a lot of
Really complex coding and things like that.
And there are a lot of communities that already have different communal ways of having that third-party mediation happen, right? I mean, these have been issues that have plagued societies since the beginning of time. So there are a lot of communities that already have different ways of dealing with, a dispute between neighbor A and neighbor B. And it's just a matter of being flexible enough to allow any new system that comes over top of that to match and mirror the processes that are already in place, and leverage the trust that's already been created.
But I guess that works probably more on a domestic level at the moment, very locally. Whereas I guess the potential of this technology is that you can do it on an international level. Because there's no way, like I'm not going to go to Papua New Guinea and try and chase the person, like I'd never get the money back.
You probably wouldn't get your life back.
I probably would not.
But if you get a chance, just write wavebl.com. So wavebl.com, it's Israeli technology, and they're already utilising blockchain technology to move containers. It's in a small trial, but it's working. I think it's on the Ethereum protocol somewhat, but basically the smart contracts are moving just as a token. But have a look at that. That's the first one I've seen that's actually not concept, and they're not trying to raise money. It's working. And obviously it's at its infant stage, but they've picked up some big contracts internationally, because it just removes so many